Yay.
Hey, everybody. Was that yay? Sorry about that. False start. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and with me is my basically co-host, Deb Romero, certified Alexander technique instructor. And today's topic is why horses stumble. And this was actually a question we got as a comment on YouTube, and
Yay.
we've been asking for them. So thank you
Yeah,
very
please send
much.
more.
Yeah, thank you very much. It makes a great topic. And why horses stumble. Today, we're going to take a look at it just through the perspective of horse owner training, developing our horse's balance, because there's enough reasons in there. So,
Mhm.
long story short, there's about a gazillion reasons why our horse will stumble. So, we're going to look at it through the lens of balance and training and movement today. The farrier also, like, there's some things we need to know for our you know, to understand whether our farrier is helping or not helping. Um, and then I will do an interview with Dr. Hancock, your vet,
Mhm.
because there is an aspect to stumbling that can be related to something more serious, like
Right.
EPM, Lymes,
Right.
even the inflammation related to diet, like with Stephanie's
Exactly.
work.
Right.
So there can be deeper, more systemic
Mhm.
problems, but we're not going to go into that today. My God, my cat is like trying to shove my
It keeps
computer
moving your
on my
screen.
desk. I'm sorry. Yeah, she desperately wants attention. The little black ears in the corner. Yes. Uh, so so today we'll talk about stumbling more from like as we're developing balance in our horses, it's not
Mhm.
uncommon to go through periods where they can stumble
And it's
because
kind of scary. I mean, if you're on them,
very scary.
it
And
can
it,
be a very scary moment. Like, what am I going to come off? Is the horse going to fall on me?
well, and you also learn the wisdom, the more familiar you get with actually influencing skeletal coordination in the horse. There are periods of time where the body's just going through a transition, a positive transition.
Right.
But anytime you're going through change and transition, there's a lot more instability in that process. And that's where a lot of stumbling can take place. And what I've learned is some periods I just need to walk because they're too
Mm.
unstable. The likelihood of tripping and actually falling or doing something dangerous increases with speed.
That's the same as people. With the Alexander work, we slow everything down.
Yeah,
We go back to the beginnings of everything to look at the why.
right. And so globally, when we take a horse that we want to improve balance, the two biggest transitions are as we learn about the axial skeleton and spinal functions and engagement, we're basically helping our horse transition from stabilizing the body through tight muscles
Mm,
into stabilizing the axial skeleton. So we're transitioning from muscular stability to skeletal stability. And that's a
right.
big ass deal.
Right.
It's a really
It's
big
a big
ass
deal in
deal.
people too. I
Yeah.
mean, even people that are non-riders, you can see a contraction or a pull down as a subconscious response
Yeah,
to
because
something, and it's really takes a lot of work to train out of that.
yeah, and stability is an unconscious primary, I would say number one primary requirement for a body in motion.
Right.
And so when we see stumbling, we go, "Oh, that's bad." But I go, "Oh, they can be pretty unstable and not stumble too."
That's true.
Right? Because horses with four legs and this big torso, it takes a lot for a horse to fall over. Just like if we're standing upright, it's easier for us to fall over than if we were down on all fours. If we're on our
Right.
hands and knees, it takes a lot more for us to actually fall over. And so when we see horses stumbling, I go, that is a pretty serious level of skeletal instability. So
That's a good way
even,
to put it. It's just not organized properly.
yeah. And
Right.
so that transition, like horses that tend to be tight, super tight muscularly, they're
Mm,
cranky to be touched, or your massage
mm,
therapist tells you they're riddled with tension. Um, and they're also will always be either not wanting to go forward or can't slow down. That'll go hand in hand with
right.
horses that are stabilizing the body primarily through
Muscular efforting. Yeah.
muscular effort. And what that always tells us is tight, sore muscles on the outer edges of the body are always there because that skull, spine, rib cage, and pelvis is not stable skeletally.
And that's a really good point because looking at things with our eyes, that's what we see is the external muscles, which are not the muscles of balance or posture.
Right.
The
Right.
the I think we've talked about this, but it was a long time ago that the muscles that help the skeleton balance are very deep, close to the bones. So we can't see that. All we can see is the reflection of what happens when they're not working right.
From the inside out.
Right.
Absolutely, literally. And I
Literally.
think I think you said something really interesting one time that stuck with me. Tell me if I have this right. That typically the more the body uses the outer layers of muscles, that the core muscles can actually atrophy. So if the axial skeleton is sort of loose and unstable, it actually weakens the deeper layers of muscle, which is why the outer layers of muscle have to work so hard. Is
Yeah,
that
that's an interesting,
accurate?
yeah. Yeah, that's accurate. And if,
Okay.
I mean, it's just, if you don't use it, you lose it. It's the same, it's the same concept. Use it properly. But yeah, and I just got done with that fascial study, which I hope to present at some time. But they were saying on that farm boys actually had better performance than bodybuilders
Oh
just
yeah.
just because of that overdevelopment, even down to the fascial tissue, which that's another whole.
Interesting.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
that was fascinating, how much the fascia plays, and it's not just muscles. There's a whole fascial system we haven't even talked about
No,
that
and I'll
is
often say that because like when people show halter horses, they want the halter
mm,
horses to look like bodybuilders. That's what wins.
that's true.
And I go, but what it also does is it doesn't make good movement. But
No, they
that's,
move like crap.
yeah. And so, yeah, that's one
They
way to put
move like
it. Yeah.
crap.
Yeah. And they don't like moving. It's like,
No, it's awful.
and that's
It's
exactly what I'm talking about is that muscle bound, that
Yep.
overdeveloped
Hmm.
outer muscle. It actually can in horses when they do that, when we're not actively trying to do that in our horse, but it happens anyways, what that tells us is that the skeletal stability is crap. That's
Right.
why the outer muscles are overworking. And so as a horse transitions, like what actually supples the muscles and releases tension is not hours of massage and stretches
No.
and yoga. I go as
Mm-mm.
soon as the skull, spine, rib cage, and pelvis become more organized and stable through our horse's midline, barrel, and hindquarters. That's what causes the muscles to let go of overworking.
And
And
like you said, that might be really ugly for a time because it's a completely different way of moving.
well, it's also not an instant transition.
Right.
The good news is it feels really good. So the horses want to transition
That's true.
what we might call the origin of the stability for the entire body. When it is skeletal stability, the muscles just don't work as hard. And so you
Right.
have more suppleness throughout the body, all the way. The core muscles work a little harder, and we feel that. but the outer muscles remain really supple. And
Yeah.
so when I'm working with a horse developing balance, there's a window of time where the skeleton is just gaining enough stability that the muscles are letting go faster and faster, because it doesn't transition all at once, but it does transition at exactly the same rate. So if the
Hmm.
skeleton becomes 10% more stable, the muscles become 10% more supple. And that exchange is where I see tripping, because they're sort of not quite stable in the skeleton fully, but they're no longer holding their stability muscularly.
Right.
And that can make kind of everything feel a little bit unstable.
Right.
And that's where the horse is most likely to stumble in
And
that
I see that in
transition.
people too, because they're going from, even though it's not appropriate or good use, but just changing that and asking something different, really is a big deal to the brain and the central nervous system.
I was going to say it is
Yeah,
it is a
it's it,
way bigger deal than most people anticipate.
exactly. And I've
Mhm.
seen people just physically stop and say, I can't do that. And I'm sure horses go through the same thing, or be expressive.
Yeah, and it's
You
that
know, it,
feeling of when you alter your proprioception. So
mhm,
anytime you're changing habitual muscle use or habitual skeletal coordination, you lose your normal sense of where your body is in space and during
mhm.
motion. And it's literally that feeling, and I think horses express it the same way I felt it, is that I don't know where my feet go exactly. Like,
Or I'm going to speed up or slow down because this doesn't make sense to me right now.
yeah. And when we
Yeah,
have a habit of movement, we don't think about walking, we just walk.
right.
But whenever we change habitual muscle use, even if we're going from over tight back to supple and healthy, and we're changing skeletal coordination, even if we're going from disastrously unstable to a little bit stable, we suddenly kind of don't have the same perception of where our body is all the time. And it's
Hmm.
unnerving.
Hmm.
And it can be a little scary. Some horses I have to slow down because they'll start to get defensive. And other horses just plow into it and they're like, oh, I stumble a little, but I'm okay. No big deal. I got this. Right. And people respond the same way. I mean, it's unique to the individual how we
Right.
respond to that change. But that is in your work and my work. In order to release pain, you're sort of saying, okay, these muscles need to quit working so hard. And the only way to get those muscles to quit working so hard is to improve the stability through the head, spine, ribs, or pelvis.
Mhm.
Like that's where we should be stable.
Right.
And if we're not, the muscles unconsciously, instantly kick in so that we
Mhm.
don't fall over. Like,
In the external, the ones we see, that
hmm
we actually can physically see, yeah. Because if you don't have core, and I don't mean core as ab muscles, but the primary core of the whole spine organized properly, the body's going to compensate.
but even our deeper muscles, like a lot of times when I'm helping a female rider strengthen their seat,
Hmm.
I go straight to the lumbar and you can feel chronic contraction
Yeah,
around the lumbar, right? And as soon as we try to lengthen those muscles, well, we alter the use of the lumbar and the muscles release tension as the result.
right,
Right. And then you're using different muscles. But I
right.
go, we can even overuse the psoas and the back muscles and the deeper muscles. We can overuse those if the skeleton is not stable.
Oh, agree.
So,
That's a whole nother podcast about the psoas, because that's in horses and humans. Way over, improperly used, I'm gonna say. Improperly
psoas,
used.
like I do want to do a podcast on sort of that connection of um, psoas, diaphragm,
The
psoas,
diaphragm, the crural ligament attachment. Yeah.
yeah, diaphragm,
We digress.
psoas, and yeah, we're digressing.
We're
Okay.
digressing.
But anyways, okay.
Yeah, that'll be a good one. Please send us a reminder, somebody.
So the other thing that causes stumbling, even when we're making positive changes to balance, so we talked about a global transition through the body. That is, I can't even overstate this. It's a big ass deal to us and
Mm.
our horse to transition from stabilizing primarily through soft tissue into stabilizing through more stable skeletal coordination. So it's either the skeleton or the muscles. It's that as our primary source of stability
Mhm.
for us and our horse. So that transition is a big deal. And then the second big transition for horses that we have a hard time understanding is them learning to stabilize their motion through the back and hindquarters rather than the forehand.
Amen.
And so
Big
that
deal.
transition is a very big deal
Very big
because
deal.
if the horse's back and hindquarters, number one, aren't stable skeletally, and then number two, aren't strong enough muscularly to resist their own body weight from falling on their own front legs or resist the force of propulsion and create stability, then all of the stability has to fall to the front legs, shoulders, neck, head, a little bit upper back or chest. And so the thoracic sling gets super tight because it's having to
All
bear the
that force
it's
coming
having
down on it.
to stabilize the body because the body isn't stable in the back half. The front half
Right.
automatically takes over.
And it's
And
pretty much like we say, it's pure physics, really.
yeah. And
It's
so
just it's momentum. It's gonna go somewhere.
it's got to go somewhere. And if the
Right.
horse can't stabilize through the front end or the hind end, we're going to see a boatload of tripping,
Yeah.
hind feet or front feet, right? So this other big global change, and just like muscle and skeleton, as the horse increases stability through the back and the hindquarter, it automatically is alleviating the weight load from the forehand.
Right.
So as soon as the forehand has 1 or 2 ounces of less weight than what it's used to, again, you have that, I don't know where my front feet go, and you can
Right.
get stumbling. And it's also changing at the same rate. So 10% more stability and strength through the back and hindquarter is alleviating 10% of the body weight from the front end. So you're going to get 10% more muscular suppleness through the shoulders, thoracic sling, neck, and you're going to have less weight. And I literally, like, my sort of joke was, especially with young horses, that transition from front end stability to back and hindquarter stability, the horses have a little hesitation in the step of the front leg. And I kind of
Mm.
joke because it feels like when you play that game Twister and you're trying to go right foot yellow, left foot blue, like you have to kind of think for a second, where does your hand or your foot go? That's exactly that kind of pause or hesitation I feel in the horses because all of a sudden their front legs are lighter, which means
Right.
they're suddenly more mobile. Like they all of a sudden can take a longer stride. And that's not where my feet usually land. Thank you very much. And so all of a sudden the feet don't quite know how to navigate the ground and when they stumble, now it throws the hind end back out of stability too. And so it's this
Right.
kind of back
The
and
ripple
forth.
effect. Yep.
Yeah. So just like going from muscle to skeleton, sort of the horse having to transition from I control my movement, I generate and control all movement through the back and hindquarters, right? If they're not doing that, then the forehand takes over the job. Otherwise, they fall over. And just that transition of primarily stabilizing on the forehand to mainly stabilizing through the hindquarter, I go, that's that same back and forth where you get a lot of stumbling. You
And
just kind of,
Rafalco's coming up in my mind because I'm also thinking if you go from riding with backwards contact and thinking you're driving the horse forward to balance the horse, and then all of a sudden say, okay, let's find self-carriage.
yeah.
It's like, what?
And
They're gonna feel like they're gonna fall on their face.
well, it feels like a toddler. It
Yeah,
feels like a toddler kind of,
just the momentum of falling forward.
yes.
Woo! Catch up with your legs.
Yeah. And so there is like, if you look at toddlers sort of mastering walking and then
Hmm.
running and climbing and that kind of thing, there's a lot of stumbling, there's a lot of awkward moments, there's
A
a
lot of
lot of that.
falling,
Hmm.
a lot of bashes in the head.
And that's probably the best way that we can relate. Not that we all remember being toddlers, but it's like it's kind of that same process as a horse is learning to shift balance from forehand to hindquarters, or
You
as
know,
the horse is
yeah,
learning to go from the muscles to the skeleton for stability. And it's that same process of going where I'm going to make a boatload, a
of
cajillion
mistakes.
mistakes and errors.
Yeah,
And if I really blow it, I'm going to actually stumble and possibly fall. And that's when I feel that kind of toddler organization is when
mhm.
I just fall back to working at the walk until it
Good point.
stabilizes again.
It's that slowing it all down because we can't master it with speed. I mean, you look at Olympians, they in their training are slowing everything down. They're looking at every minute movement to
Yes,
get that upper level achievement of movement.
right.
You know, they don't go out
Exactly.
and just keep running and hoping it gets better.
Exactly, which is what we do to horses. Yes. Yes. If I
They're
could,
like in the lab, they've got people watching and measuring and, making a lot, and they're very amenable to change, like adaptability, and some horses adapt better than others, or people for that matter.
no, and top human athletes are no different. If they want to make one change to their habitual skeletal coordination within the sport they play, you have to spend hours, days, weeks, months, depending on the individual, practicing a new repetitive movement until it's integrated in the nervous system. And I go, there's no shortcut for that.
There is no shortcut.
I go,
And
it's,
I can even attest to putting hands on a over 20 years experienced Alexander teacher. I was just putting hands on in school to feel her going out of a chair. And I felt her tense her low back. And she looked at me and I looked at her and she said, did I just do that? And I said, yeah, you did. So,
it's, yeah,
even with all the training we have, sometimes those old habits come back up again.
yes. And brains love a default setting.
Yeah, they do.
That's why it's so hard to change muscle use and skeletal coordination because the first thing that happens is our brain screams no. And then if we feel a little disoriented and we stumble, our brain sends out a red alert that we're not safe.
The
And
central
so,
nervous system kicks in, yeah, because the central nervous system in the spine wants to feel safe. It's going to do
yeah.
whatever it has to do to make that happen.
And so usually the first layer of change when I'm rehabbing a horse, that will be the window of time where if they have a sudden big change or a stumble, they can have a stress response
Mhm.
because it can alert the body that you're not safe. Once they go through the first one or sometimes two or
Mhm.
three, they stumble away and it doesn't bother them. They just sort of go, oh, shoot, I kind of missed that with my foot. So I look a lot at the energy that my horse has, body language, expression that go hand in hand with the
Mhm.
act of stumbling. Because I go that, if it's a coordination issue, they're typically pretty calm when they stumble. And
That's a
in
good
it
point. They don't
eh,
tense up or go into extension
or have a panic
or
attack
have a
or
buck or
buck, rear, blow up,
rear,
whatever. Yeah.
whatever.
And I
Yeah,
have had horses have a stress response to a positive change. So I go, that's possible. Or if they stumble, I've also had people push it. The horse isn't really stable or balanced enough to trot or canter, but they do it anyways. And horses can go down on their knees. They
I've seen it.
can they can stumble and it's suddenly at trot and canter, it's not just a little stumble anymore. Now the front end is going down.
Right.
And some horses can pop back up and recover. Some horses will flip over. Some will fall on their sides. Some riders can stay on. Some riders go flying off. I go, all of that's the unique part. But if I don't feel like my horse is stable skeletally and has a nice flowing rhythm at the walk, then it might not be the time to add speed. We might need to
Right.
spend a little time with slow, repetitive practice until the nervous system has a new default setting. Then when you add speed, the the brain is relying on the default setting to stay stable when you add speed. It's not a different coordination at each speed. It's the same
Right.
coordination. It's just
It's just more
more
speed,
speed.
more you're asking for it faster.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so that means we can't keep up. We can't consciously use our brain to direct our feet as we add speed. The feet
Right.
kind of have to know where to go.
Is
And
is
that's
that is that where the metronome might come in?
well, the metronome is about stabilizing.
Right.
It's about really balancing the forward and backward swing of the legs. So in that transitions, from muscle to skeleton, from front end to hind end, that stability of, a steady tempo can help the horse re-stabilize during the changing period of change. That's where
I
it
would
kind of
think it would
helps.
help the human too, because we're not realizing our input into are we really not asking for forward?
Well, and that's the other thing is as the horse is improving balance, they all go through these what I call the two big global transitions, muscle to skeleton, forehand to hindquarters.
Right.
And in those two big global transitions, our balance and stability is challenged more, not
Right.
less. And so if we can't stay stable during that transition for the horse, then our horse can't make the transition.
I agree.
And we just get a whole bunch of loose movement, like the horse has 8 legs, and it's no fun for anybody. So, so to me, stumbling during work is kind of a sign. I would take it as a sign that the horse is in the middle of one of those two global transitions. Whatever detail we're working on, that's a little bit of a take a step back. And if my horse is stumbling a lot, and that can be true on the front legs or the hind legs for the horse, it
That's a
doesn't
good point.
matter.
I was going to bring that up,
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It just the stumbling and missteps are very tied into that process of change, even a positive change.
hmm
If we're not actively working on those two global changes, which not everybody does when they ride their horse,
hmm
the other reason horses stumble is because they're running out of the muscular capacity to stabilize through their muscles. And underneath that is a very loosey-goosey, unstable spine, rib cage, and pelvis. And so at a certain age, when we associate it with age, it's because stabilizing the body through muscle is really inefficient. So I
Right.
go, young horses do it all the time, no
They can do
problem.
it for hours on end.
Young
Just put them on a
riders,
lunge line and you'll see.
yeah, young riders do it all the time,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So the skeletal coordination can be massively dysfunctional, but the muscles are like, we're good, we got this,
We
no
got this.
problem. Yeah. And so older horses, or as we age, all of a sudden we don't have the same amount of muscular strength that we used to have. And so, like we've talked about, the greatest fear when we age is falling
Yeah, I
because
was going to bring up if anybody really wants to know what being on the forehand feels like, just get on crutches or a walker
Mhm.
and see how that affects your stability in your back.
Yeah, because it's the same for us. If our spine, rib cage, and pelvis is losing stability, we also overuse our muscles unconsciously. Nobody has to teach
Yeah.
us to do it.
No,
It is
that's
automatic.
preservation. That's self-preservation by the central nervous system to kick that in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we feel, at least when I work with riders first, they gain a lot of sympathy for what their horse is now going to go through. Right. But if we're not actively changing our horse's balance and skeletal coordination, the other reason horses trip and stumble is they've been on the forehand too long. The horse cannot
They're
cope
fatigued.
anymore.
They're
It's just,
fatigued. It's
it's
pure.
fatigued.
Hmm.
And so without skeletal stability, there's going to be more stumbling, more tripping, more falling unless we change things. My cat's hitting my little laptop box
I
again.
love it. What an intelligent cat, I tell you
I know
what.
she likes her mama time. So anytime I'm on a Zoom meeting now, she's like right
She's
next to my
there.
laptop. So um so that's a sign. If we're not actually changing the balance, then the tripping and the stumbling is related to the body just fatiguing
Hmm.
in its misuse. And so
Right.
that ability to stabilize in general, if we're not doing it through the skeleton and in our horse through the back and hindquarters, then over time they just become less and less and less stable overall.
And you might come up with some sort of biomechanical lameness problem or a concussion lameness problem
Yeah,
at some point. It's
absolutely.
it's just a warning. We're telling you, the stumbling's telling you we're going down the wrong direction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if we hold them up with the bit in order to get them to not stumble, have we really changed the underlying issue?
That's like telling a toddler not to fall. It just doesn't work.
Right. So the other thing I get asked a lot about, sort of related to stumbling, is dragging the toes,
I hear that a lot.
not picking up the feet and just dragging the
Hmm.
toes, particularly in the hind legs.
Yep, I hear that a lot too.
But like one thing I want to mention that isn't necessarily related to balance, it's more related to having a good farrier, is when a horse's hoof grows, and this is why we trim them, every time a horse grows more hoof, the hoof is growing forward as much as it's growing downward. Does that
Hmm.
make
Good
sense?
point.
So
To
we
me,
think
I
of,
say like it's growing more towards the toe instead of the heel.
yeah, so the
Yeah,
whole hoof grows towards the toe
right,
as we get more growth downward,
right.
right? So the hoof grows out of the coronary band. And if you think of it, it just sort of follows that path of the
Hmm.
pastern, right?
Right.
So the hoof grows forward in line with the pastern, ideally. But my sister, the vet, described it best. This really stuck in my mind. If the toes are too long on a horse and the farrier doesn't cut them back when he trims the bottoms, then it feels to the horse like trying to walk with flippers on. So
Wow,
a long toe on a horse would feel like if we strap on swimming flippers or scuba diving flippers or fins, whatever you
that's
call
a
them.
lot of stress on the ligament system
Yeah.
in the leg.
Yeah. So it's like trying to do a beach dive where you have to walk along the beach with your flippers on. You feel like a fish out of water. Like it's
Yeah,
just so awkward. And again, you will trip over the fin because you have more toe than what you're used to having or what you
right.
should have for your balance. And so we can have a conversation with our farrier. And if I never tell the farrier what to do, but if I notice my horse's toes are kind of getting longer and longer over time, I might schedule my vet with the x-ray machine to meet me on the same day my farrier comes. because some farriers are a little shy about taking the toe back and don't want
Yeah,
to,
I hear that a lot.
open the white line. But with x-rays, when we can see where the bone
You
is,
got to, yeah, to see the relationship between what you see on the outside and the inside.
yeah. So
Yep,
never, never, ever, 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 never, ever, ever tell your farrier how to trim your horse.
probably not a good idea.
No, you'll be fired. Um,
Probably.
or you'll go through a lot of farriers. But what you can do is call your vet, and the truth is in the x-ray. Then
Yeah,
it's not personal, and either your farrier was spot on and you're wrong, or your farrier was being too conservative on the toe. And
exactly. I hear that happens a lot here.
yeah.
I see that on a lot of information that comes through Dr. Hancock's office on her,
Well, and the
recording.
farriers, very few farriers have x-ray vision. I go, some do actually, but very few farriers aren't are able to look at x-rays. So they're sort of guessing where that bone is. And the last thing any farrier wants to do is hand you a lame horse when they're done. So
Right.
they're always going to be conservative, but sometimes they can be too conservative or conservative for too long, and those toes start getting away from,
Mhm.
the farrier, getting longer and longer, and that can cause our horse to stumble. It can also
Mhm.
make it difficult for our horse to balance. And so I just go get the vet. The vet will tell the farrier, so you don't have to. And the x-rays put everybody on the same page. And even if you say, I want to do a baseline, I go, there's nothing wrong with my horse. I just want a baseline.
You
It
should
is,
always get it every few years. I really firmly believe
yeah, and it
you
just
need a
gets the
baseline of what's going
farrier.
on the inside.
Yeah, it gets your farrier on the right page with your
Hmm.
horse's unique foot and hoof growth.
Hmm.
And that is to me, well, money well spent.
It's like it's a physical, I have it as part of a physical sometimes. It's like, let's just get some updated x-rays. So if we do have a problem,
Yeah. Well, and part
laminitis is
of
a big deal. If we do have that down the road, we've got a baseline to compare it to
yes, absolutely. To
so that
see
we
if
know the
there's
path and the direction we need to go.
absolutely. And part of my confidence in my farrier is every time we've had to do hoof x-rays of horses that he was trimming for long periods, every time we do a hoof x-ray, he is spot on. That hoof angle is perfect to the bone as if he had x-ray vision. He's just good at what he does.
Right.
And that's part of the reason, I've had him for so long as my farrier, especially with tricky horses, is I've seen more than a dozen times his trims on the x-rays are spot on perfect. And so
Right.
I go, that's hard to find, but when you find one, you can kind of deal with everything else. He's terrible about keeping an appointment, but I don't care. So, okay, so that's about the toes. So the toe dragging can be long toes.
Mhm.
The stumbling can be long toes. And the toe dragging, I guess front as well as hind, but it's more often the horse will pick up the front feet but still drag the toe on the hind feet. And the main reason for that traces back to all of the podcasts we just did on pelvic engagement.
Right.
I go because if the pelvic bones are unstable, if the relationship between the lumbar, sacrum, and pelvis through the SI joint is under stress, undue stress, then the hip joint is going to lock, and the stifle, hock, and fetlock are going to be restricted in their mobility.
Right.
And this is the importance, I guess, about understanding mechanics is the body has to stabilize somewhere. So
Exactly.
I go, if the lumbar, sacrum, and pelvic bones are not stable, then the joints of the legs are going to reduce mobility in order to create stability.
And it's the same thing.
Instantly.
Yep. It's the same thing in people. Like we talked about the psoas. When you lock that psoas, the body's got to compensate because the psoas is as big around as your fist. It's a very powerful, it's not supposed to be a hip stabilizer. It's supposed to be a hip flexor. It's not meant,
Interesting.
it's not meant to stay in a hard contraction all the time to support your low back.
Right.
So when we do that, which a lot of people do these days because we're sitting at desks all the time, as soon as we go into movement, it maintains its contraction. And then you get
Interesting.
the dysfunction of the lower limbs.
We're going to do a whole podcast on the
On the
psoas. I'm
silly
going to make a
psoas. We're
note.
going to
I
call it
know.
the silly psoas. I don't know.
P.S. O.A.
PSOAS.
S.
Mm-hmm.
psoas.
I mean,
We're
I can speak to it from the human perspective, but
well, we keep digressing, so we'll come back to stumbling. But
okay.
so, and I got this question a lot, like on my YouTube channel, I did under a case study, a horse named Ozzy, and that question came up a lot because he was
I
dragging
saw it.
his
Remember
toes.
that. I remember
hmm
that.
And basically, what it means is as I'm working to stabilize the whole thoracic spine and rib cage, but
Right.
I'm kind of starting with the lumbar sacrum pelvis. I'm starting hindquarter engagement. And if we just say engagement equals stability, that's an easy way to understand it. If those bones, lumbar sacrum and pelvic bones, are not stable, then the joints are not going through a complete range of motion between flexion
Exactly.
and extension. And so the less the leg joints flex, the more the toe drags because the horse has to. So flexion, like if I flex my elbow, I'm just bending my elbow, right? Which is bringing my arm bones closer together. So when we talk about flexing the hip joint, it's bringing the thigh bone and the pelvic bone closer together. If we talk about flexing the stifle, it's sort of bringing the thigh bone and the hock closer together, right? Or lower leg bone.
Right.
And if we're talking about flexion through the hock, it's bringing the mid and lower leg bones together, right? And so if those joints are playing the role of stability, then they won't flex like that. And if they don't flex like that, the foot doesn't come off the ground.
So the visual I'm getting in my head is because Finer Things does this, is she would be much happier having her back go up and down and stiffening her joints
Yeah.
than the opposite.
Yeah.
It takes real concentration on my part and her part to say, no, no, back is supposed to be stable. Leg joints are
Legs
supposed to
bend.
move
Yes.
up and down, joints are supposed to flex.
Yes, and that's what improves the movement, and we feel the smoothness of the ride because just like our body, if we're absorbing force through the spine, it's pretty lurchy and uncomfortable and inefficient. If our spine and pelvis are stable, our leg joints are shock
Right,
absorbers. So when our joints go through full range between flexion and extension, it's literally absorbing, just like
right.
shock absorbers in a car. It's absorbing the shock of motion, and then you don't feel it through the back. And so that's why two things happen if the horse's hip, stifle, hock, and hock really, if those joints aren't able to fully flex because they're stabilizing the body, then you get excessive flexion through the fetlock joint and or the foot just drags forward.
Drags
It,
along
it
because they
doesn't,
can't pick it up.
they can't, because it's the flexing phase of the leg
Mhm.
joints that lifts the foot off the ground. And then as the foot pushes against the ground, that's the opening of the joints. That's the extension phase of the leg joints. And then the legs flex, the joints flex, and the foot comes off the ground, swings forward through the air, and lands, right? And so that ability to equalize flexion and extension through the hip, stifle, and hock is how they pick their feet up.
Right.
But if the pelvis isn't stable and the back isn't stable, they can't do that.
And that's a real interesting point because what I've been seeing happening is people are seeing that the stifle hock are not moving and thinking that they need to be injected instead of looking at, oh, the reason they can't flex is because the head, neck, back, and pelvis isn't stable.
Right. And
Yeah,
so over time, if we don't make just like a forehand to hindquarter transition or a muscle to skeletal transition, if we're not stabilizing up high, the legs have to stabilize down low. The
right.
longer they do that, right? Because the joints aren't meant for the job of stability, they're meant for the job of mobility. And
Exactly.
so what happens is the longer they're used in the role of stability, what the body does is produce more bone.
Yep.
So that's what arthritis is. And that's
Mm-hmm.
also what fusion is through a joint,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so that arthritic pain and even the inflammation or joints fusing or where we want to inject, I go inject away. But if that joint doesn't start flexing and extending equally, you now have a lifetime maintenance of joint injections or expensive medications, or your horse can't function anymore. And so the toe dragging to me it's a direct indication that the hind leg joints are not flexing enough.
Right. And it goes back to spinal stability.
Yeah. And there's
Yeah.
that transition. That's part of rehab is as I increase the skeletal stability through the lumbar sacrum and pelvis, all of a sudden, I call it knocking the rust off those joints. I go, but it's actually what the medical profession recommends to people to overcome arthritis or to manage arthritis.
Move.
Move. And
Move
when you,
properly. Move
yes,
properly.
because the
Yeah,
dysfunctional movement is what creates arthritis.
exactly.
And ironically, the remedy to arthritis is correct mechanical function in movement. And
And
so I
that's why
go,
we go to PT, right?
right. It's also, again, if our horse is dragging the toe, adding speed and force at trot and canter doesn't always help. It can make matters worse. And so this is the reason I know we've talked about this. People use ground poles because they go, oh, if the horse has to step up over the ground pole, I'm encouraging more flexion through the leg joints, which should help. And I go, okay, I get it. But is the horse stabilizing the pelvis while they're
Right.
flexing the leg? Or is the flexion of the leg further destabilizing the
Using the
pelvis?
back. Yep.
And
I
nobody asks
agree.
that question.
No, because nobody looks at stabilization of the back as important. They just see the kinematics of the legs.
Yeah. So a lot of people who are diligently using ground poles, I go, their horse just keeps dragging the toe because it's not addressing the stability requirement of higher, which is what allows the mobility to return to the leg joints.
Right.
And I go, that's one of those things you can't fake your way around. Like
No,
I go, it is what it is. And you can't convince the body.
exactly.
Like what I have seen is if people kind of force the mobility of the leg joints, not realizing that the lumbar sacrum and pelvis are also too immobile, what you have is a horse that ends up massively on the forehand, really overworking hard muscularly because they're losing all skeletal stability between the joints and the axial
Right.
skeleton. And so all of a sudden, there's no other option than to put all their weight on the front legs and just go about their life as best they can. And so when we force leg mobility that makes us feel better because we can see it, but
Right.
we have no clue about the axial stability, we can actually further
Yeah.
destabilize our horse's movement and get, instead of just toe dragging, now we're going to get some severe tripping.
Right. Or even some biomechanical lameness somewhere else.
Or pain issues,
Yeah,
or
because the
yeah,
body's not going to handle that level of stress.
mm-mm,
Yeah,
no.
agreed.
And I know with you with AT, like that transition of changing muscle use and skeletal use is so subtle and gentle to watch.
Right.
but internally it overwhelms
It's
people and
huge.
horses.
It's
It feels
huge.
huge. And if we're not respectful of that process, we can actually kind of create problems even with the best of intentions.
Yeah,
And I know you've told me all bodies change at different rates.
exactly.
And I go, it's the same for horses. Some horses welcome the change faster. Other horses resist the change, sometimes because it's scary, sometimes because it's painful.
All of the
And
above. Yeah.
yeah.
And you don't know.
And so, what would you say? Is there anything different than what we've covered with horses? Is the reason people stumble?
No, I guess the difference with people, one more thing to add, and I don't know about horses, but it's the changing the thought process that changes the movement. You have to rewire the circuits in the brain,
In order to
uh,
reorganize movement
and in order to reorganize movement. It doesn't come, if you, like you said, with ground poles. It doesn't come by, say, step this way.
or the step machine at the gym? Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
all of that. It comes with unraveling, and maybe even with horses, the subconscious wiring of movement that's dysfunctional,
Yeah.
bringing it to the surface, saying, okay, here we are. What tools in my tool belt do I have to help this horse person at this moment
Yeah,
move to
because
another level?
when we talk about patterns of movement, habits of movement,
Hmm.
unconscious defaults, settings for movement, we're really talking about the somatic portion of the nervous system,
Exactly.
which is how we consciously or unconsciously direct movement. And so when we're talking monkeying with the nervous system,
Mhm.
I go, that's like monkeying around with the wiring in your house. It's a pretty
Exactly.
big deal.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, it's just a big deal. And so you're saying kind of the same thing, that as you're going through that sort of rewiring process, that is the likely time that we bump into walls or trip over our own feet or take a misstep off of a curb, something like that.
Yeah, or the lack of consciousness of what we're doing.
Hmm.
Already having our thought on the next project instead of paying attention to the
Oh,
curb that's in front of you.
that's interesting because I didn't finally found her way to my lap.
There we go.
Um, I didn't think about that, but you're absolutely right. Because another aspect, another way to look at stumbling, tripping, missteps, toe dragging. Well, toe dragging's a little different, but when we're in a stress response, we're not really as aware. We're kind of
We've
focused
we've
on
tapped
the
into a different circuitry at that time.
yeah, and we're focused on the thing that is stressing us out.
Exactly.
And so we're no longer sort of self-aware.
Hmm.
And I find that is also true with horses. If they're not calm, if they're highly
If they're
anxious,
not
if
in the learning
they're
frame of mind, yeah, don't
yeah,
bother.
if they feel defensive or stressed out or fearful or angry or aggressive, they also might have more of a tendency to trip because they're just not self-aware.
Exactly.
They're just not self-aware.
Deer in the headlights.
Yeah.
Woo!
Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons that they stumble. And that's where I go, okay, the only way to ascertain if it's just part of a natural positive process or if it's indicating a problem that we need to go uncover is kind of around the maybe the frequency of the stumbling as well as the energy our horse is demonstrating while stumbling.
Yeah,
Because if our horse is not kind of calm and mentally focused while stumbling, we probably have a big issue related to their balance. And if they are calm and focused and we're sort of actively working on balance and they're stumbling, I go, that's just part of the process.
right.
It'll go away as the balance gets better. So
Yeah. And just
it,
rule out the other things, like you said, with um, your vet and farrier.
Yeah, like I
just to be
will try to
sure.
do a podcast with my farrier when I can pin him down one day. But I will meet with Dr. Hancock
Okay.
because
Yeah. Just to,
stumbling and toe dragging and not knowing where their feet go absolutely can indicate a really serious systemic issue like EPM, Lymes, or
Mhm.
you're reaching like a really critical threshold of inflammation in the body
Yes,
somewhere.
could be a diet toxicity. Who
Hmm.
knows?
Yeah,
Yeah, to rule those out would be good.
yeah. And that's what actually one of the worst signs of, say, EPM is when the horse gets ataxic, which
A
basically
neurological.
means
Hmm.
that they can't control their feet.
Yeah,
And that is
that's a
one of the
scary time.
severe signs. So before they become ataxic, we might start to see a lot more tripping or toe dragging or stumbling or things like that.
Mhm.
So I will do a different one. That's a much larger issue that we hope we don't have,
Right.
but that can be the importance of paying attention to how often our horse trips or stumbles or drags their feet.
Yep.
Absolutely. Final thoughts?
Just keep tapping into the subconscious use of yourself.
Yep. Yep. And it's not
So,
that different, your work with AT with people and my work with
mm-mm.
horses. It's pretty much based on
It's
the
the
same
same
theory.
principles. Yep.
Hmm. So thanks everybody for joining us for another episode. Thank you to I
Love
can't
that question. Loved
love
it.
love getting
I love
questions
getting questions.
and love discussing different topics. And there's endless things we can talk about with horses, but it's always nice to have an idea that you and I didn't have to generate.
Yeah.
Like,
We're a little
yeah,
selfish
sometimes I
that
go,
way,
did
right?
we already talk about that? Did
Did
we
we
not
talk
talk
about
about
that?
that? Are we recycling topics? So, anyways, the questions are a welcome relief. Thank you
Yes.
very much. Much appreciated. And we hope you enjoyed our discussion about it today. Thanks for joining us. Please like, please share, please subscribe. It really helps if you think this information is important for our horse world, then that's how you can share it
Yes.
and support
Thanks,
it.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.